Okay, I'll do this today and I'll do it Monday and then when we do it anymore, but we need to make sure that we have the right details. Alejandro? Tiffany, Asaf Mansour. Peyton? Is it Hayton or Hot? Morgan Barton. Megan Burkhardt. Leslie Burnett. Young Cow. Madeline Cook. Evans Alana. Madeline Dixon. Jessica Kirkson. Catherine Fleming. Kate. Ryan Green. Brandon Hope. Katsunari Hoshi. Travis Kent. Moses Smith. Nicholas McDonald. Howard Dent. Tyson. So do you have that certificate, Tyson? Cody O'Connor.
Here.
Hannah Ostrander. Nina Park. Celeste Raymond.
Here.
Nicole Reed. Katie Rubstello. Riley Shannon. Gary Schumacher.
Here. Here.
Thanks. That's some more than anticipating going flying off the desk. Jaden Stevenson. Skylar White Colton. Lucy Wilhelm. Eli Yang. Riley Wood. Shannon Alman. Preston Young. So, we didn't get their name called. What's your name?
Nicholas McDonald. Riley Shannon. Howard Dent.
Anybody else? Okay. Okay, for Monday and Wednesday next week, you should, well, for Monday, I'd like you to go through, be ready to go through in class the problems that are at the end of chapter 4. There's a section that's problems and applications, just do all of them. They're on what we're doing today. And then for Monday and Wednesday, you should have read, you should get through reading chapter 5. Yes.
I have a question about the 3 quizzes that you have listed on the syllabus.
Yep.
Will there be advance notice? for those?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just making sure.
Yeah, you'll have a review session the period before. I think I already have the dates, so I just haven't confirmed them in my head yet.
for Monday, just the questions for review or everything?
On the other page. Yep.
Just
Problems
all
with
the-
that?
Problems and
all the
applications.
templates?
You should do the other ones too, but we're gonna go over that, so. Okay. What we do today is really the foundation of everything we do the rest of the quarter, and actually it's the foundation of what we would look at as modern economics. So we talk about all sorts of things in econ, and economists do research in everything from evolutionary biology to physics to business cycles to everything else. But the only thing they really hang their hat on as a theoretical structure is what we do today. And the first thing we start with is the first law of demand. The first law of demand says that there is an inverse relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded of the good. Which translates into simple notation as if the price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down, and if the price goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. So there have been attempts over the ages to try to explain why you have that particular relationship. I don't think anybody's come up with a great one, but we observe it. You lower the price of something and people buy more of it. You rarely see situations where you raise the price of something and people buy more of it without something else attached to it. So this is sort of what we hang our hats on in terms of when we're doing analysis. And just so we have it with us, there is a second law of demand. Has more to do with what you're going to see in chapter 5, which is something called elasticity. The second law of demand says the longer period of time demanders have to adjust to a price change, greater will be the adjustment. Second one's a little more subtle, but as we go through 4 or 5 different sets of analyses over the next 6 weeks, we'll see that the second law of demand comes into play a lot. You may not, you observe a price change, you don't see something happen, or you see something happen. It's just a tiny bit, and you go, oh. Not much happened according to the first law of demand, but if you look 6 weeks later, or a year later, or something like that, there's been a big adjustment. There's a reason for that we can fall back on. The thing to note on both of these is that there's nothing implicit in the first law of demand or the second law of demand It says how much a price change will cause a quantity to demand. So it doesn't say the increased price is going to change 10% or 20% or 30%. There are all sorts of characteristics of goods in marketplaces. It will drive that sort of question, but it's really an empirical question. It comes down to things like are there substitutes, what's the availability in the marketplace. And we'll deal with that all the time, but it's not really a theoretical question. So the table we did the other day, which was quantity and price, and it was slide 2. So that's a demand curve. When we describe demand, we're saying, well, this is demand, this whole thing. And the law of demand refers to the fact that it's downward sloping, or if there's an inverse relationship within that table or within that curve. And when we graph it, whether it's this one or some other demand curve, it's always downward sloping. That's what the first law of demand says. And it can look all sorts of ways. It can look like that, it can look like this, it can look like that, it could be like that. I guess it could have curly keys in it as long as it's downward sloping. We deal with straight line demand curves because they're easy to use graphically. We get a lot of implications out of them. In reality, when we're looking at marketplaces, it's rare that you're moving a price 50% down or 50% out. So what you're seeing in the oil market right now, where in June the price of oil was $1.15 or $1.13, or excuse me, the barrel was $113, and now you can buy a barrel of oil in North Dakota this week for $37. So huge decrease. The trouble is you can't get it out of there unless you put it on a truck. That's why the pipeline's such an issue. But price of oil generally, North Sea Brent oil, which is sort of the standard that they measure things against, is about $50. Probably may have gone under 50 today. You rarely see those sorts of price changes. We're normally looking at some little portion of the demand curve, not some big portion of it. But for analytical purposes, again, we use these straight lines and they give us more information. What else? So all of your demand curves are going to be bounded by either, that's a perfectly downward sloping demand curve. In other words, what this says, if you have a demand curve that looks like this is how much is purchased and it doesn't matter what the price is. So imagine that they develop a drug that if you have the Ebola virus, it immediately cures the Ebola virus. The demand for that's going to be pretty high since the mortality rate is pretty high. So you would have it doesn't really matter what the price is, you're going to still have the same quantity at the end of that particular good. People would apply that to insulin and things like that. That's probably less so. Insulin probably looks more like that. The price rises, there's a little less insulin demanded, but it doesn't go to zero. And there's a little less demanded because people with diabetes go adjust their diets, they'll try different sorts of things to make up for the fact that there's a higher price of insulin. So you can get vertical, almost vertical demand curves. And you can also get almost horizontal demand curves. And those are things like, that's a demand curve at 7-Eleven for M&Ms. So if they try to raise the price of M&Ms, and raise the price of any other candy, you just switch to something else. So they go, okay, I'm gonna double the price of M&Ms. You go, I'm not gonna buy M&Ms. So you immediately buy none. So they're always buying the same thing. So you get, in marketplaces, certain marketplaces we'll find we get almost horizontal demand curves. Generally speaking, though, we're going to be somewhere in the middle here. So we're going to have some demand curve that looks like that. The first law of demand refers to movement along the demand curve. Here's quantity per unit of time, here's dollars, here's a downward sloping demand curve. The first law of demand refers to movement along this curve, either down or up. When we talk about demand, so when I say demand for oil, or demand for automobiles, or demand for pizzas, or demand for Seahawks gear, which is a phenomenal industry right now. A guy in my office downtown has a Seahawks shirt on. It's an official NFL Seahawks shirt that he bought a month ago for like $138. And he went to the Nike store, and they have a thing that looks the same as far as I can tell. This is another Seahawks shirt with somebody's number on it. It's $250, and they're selling them. So demand's gone up, but demand's gone up for a reason, which we'll come back to. We're able to sell those things. When we talk about the law of demand, circle that in your definition. We're talking about quantity demanded refers to a point on a demand curve. In other words, this is demand, there's a demand curve. And the first law of demand refers to the fact that it's downward sloping. It doesn't refer to different curves. As we'll see in a little bit, you can have different curves. It strictly refers to the fact that there's that inverse relationship within what we call a demand curve, which is this, the graphical piece, or a demand schedule. So this is a demand schedule. It just shows prices and quantities. And that's where the inverse relationship is, within that schedule itself. So, just as a quick aside, and we'll be coming back to this a lot, what's the second law of demand say? If this is our demand schedule, let's just do here. There's the demand curve. What the second law of demand says, if you decrease price, let's say for whatever reason, price is at P1, and you decrease price at P2, to P2, the quantity demanded is going to go up to Q2 from Q1. That's what the first law of demand says. The second law of demand says that over time, Q2 will be out here. This curve will get flatter. And the reason it's getting flatter is you have more time to adjust to the price change. You have more time to figure out, oh, I can use this stuff in different ways. I can substitute away from one good and another good, and so on. But we'll come back to that. This sort of adjustment is the sort of thing we need to pick up in a nuanced way as we look at certain markets. So there's the demand curve. So what we're going to do, spend half our time during the rest of the quarter is saying, okay, we're starting at one price, and at that price, there's a certain quantity demanded, let's call it QG1 and price 1, and if we lower the price to P2, we move down that demand curve and we end up at QD2. That's the first law of demand. Likewise, we're going to have scenarios where we're at P2 and all of a sudden price is going to rise to P3. You're going to move up this curve to P3 and the quantity is going to decrease. So that's the movement along the demand curve that you're going to follow. Any questions so far? So as it turns out, I should have left that there. That's how it turns out. That demand curve is dependent on a whole bunch of other things. And those other things are going to be things that arise in the marketplace in one way or another, and are going to give us information about what's going to happen in one market or another. So we start with the concept that demand is some function of the price itself. So there's an inverse relationship between those two. And again, that's movement along the curve. But there are also a whole bunch of things that might shift this curve. And it turns out that those are a lot of the things we're going to see in the marketplace that are going to determine where we end up in terms of equilibrium prices and quantities once we get to a market. So the first thing we'll look at is substitutes. If the price of a substitute goes up, the demand curve will shift out. So here's a demand curve, and let's say right now the price of this good is $5, and we're demanding 10 of them. And this particular good it's pounds of butter. I don't know how much butter costs, and I don't know how many you buy a year, but we'll say you buy 10 pounds of butter a year. And all of a sudden, the price of cooking oil goes up, doubles for some reason. Cooking oil is a substitute for butter. What we're saying is that instead of demanding 10 of them, you're going to demand something like 15 of them. This is going to go out here, but the whole demand curve shifts. So the increase in the price of the substitute is going to cause you to want more of the good at hand because you're going to substitute away from the thing that had an increase in price towards the good that you're looking at today. So you can look at how it occurs in the marketplace with cable television. Actually, you can look at the way firms do it. You've all seen advertisements trying to sell internet access or telephone services. And the prices of those things are changing all the time. So those goods are substitutes for each other. The good that's sold by Verizon is a substitute for the good that's sold by AT&T is a substitute for a good that's sold by some other carrier. What those firms are doing is when they lower their price of one, they're saying, I'm going to lower the price of this because that means you're going to substitute, some people are going to substitute away from, so when Verizon lowers its price, it's hoping people substitute away from AT&T towards Verizon. And the demand, they're trying to shift the demand curve out. will come back and play a lot with substitutes, but the relationship's a positive one. It's also a negative one. So if the price of a substitute goes down, you'll substitute away from the good you're in now towards that cheaper good that's out there. So we see this all the time. So in the Northwest, aluminum companies in particular have furnaces that burn both natural gas and oil. They're dual production, dual energy driving furnaces. And they just, if the price of natural gas goes up, they substitute away from natural gas towards oil. If the price of oil goes up, they substitute away from oil towards natural gas. All we're seeing is demand curve shifting back and forth. And that's because these goods are substitutes. You can take the substitute piece a long way. So for instance, if the price of oil gets really, really high, people substitute sweaters and jackets and stuff for heating oil. They turn their thermostats down and put on more stuff. And if oil's really cheap, they just turn up the thermostats and don't care about it. So there's substitutes that are really close substitutes, there's substitutes that are not so close, but there's still a substitute response. So what we're going to see with substitutes is changes in prices of substitutes can shift the demand curve out. It can also shift the demand curve in, depending on the direction of the change in the substitute. So substitutes are one thing. There's another set of stuff that's called complements. So the ever constant economic example of complements are tennis balls and tennis rackets. So if the price of tennis rackets goes sky high, the price of tennis balls is going to change in the opposite direction. And the demand for tennis balls is going to change in the opposite direction, because now playing tennis is more expensive. So if the price of a complement goes up, the curve is going to shift back, and if the price of the complement goes down, the complement will shoot up. So you think, oh, he's using tennis balls and tennis rackets. That's not the most helpful example in the world. Think of what's happening in the automobile market now. So as it turns out, Ford F-250 pickups and gasoline are complements to each other. They're used together by consumers to drive places. So if the price of gasoline is falling, what do you think happens to the demand for Ford F-250 pickups? It goes up. So what we're seeing in American markets today is a little bit of confusion as to what's driving automobile production. We're seeing all of a sudden American cars are having a little boost in the marketplace. And a lot of economists think that, well, it's simply the oil-gasoline price relationship with these automobiles that produce lots and lots of, use lots and lots of gasoline, and all of a sudden they become much cheaper to drive. So complements is another one. Then we get into a more interesting area, which is income. Changes in income, or changes in the market you're observing by income class, will often show you changes in demand, but it depends on the sort of good it is. We classify things as normal goods. If income rises, then demand rises or shifts up. That would be considered a normal good. So it's clothing in general, transportation uses, quality of housing, things like that. And we generally think of, even within the context of also have something that's called, so what we're imposing here, and what we're imposing generally speaking on goods is that they're normal. As income goes up, they consume more. Okay, which means that here's your demand curve, incomes rise, demand rises. And in fact, part of what we think is driving both an increase in general economic activity in the United States and at least a flicker of economic activity, increase in economic activity in Europe, is, this gets a little roundabout, the decrease in oil, price of oil, means that Americans and Europeans have more disposable income. In effect, their incomes have gone up. So they're demanding more goods and services in other areas. That's where decreases in oil look to most economists to be a good thing. If you don't own oil stocks, but you consume oil, decreases in oil prices are a good thing. If you own oil stocks, of course, it's a bad thing because you're losing money. So that's the income effect. For normal goods, we actually have another set of goods which we'll call inferior goods. In inferior goods, if a good's inferior, it means that when your income goes up, you demand less of it. So, at least in my case, McDonald's cheeseburgers were an inferior good. I devoured lots of them. As my income rose, I bought more expensive hamburgers. Now I go to Morton's for hamburgers. So, as my income's rising. So, I'm actually seeing my income goes up, but my demand for something's going down. That's because it's an inferior good. And again, even within the context of an inferior good, if McDonald's changes its prices a little bit, or Jack changes his prices a little bit, he's trying to move a demand curve in a positive way. These income changes we're talking about with inferior goods are more normally much larger effects. But what it means is that when you have a change in income, if there's a demand curve, it could go this way if it's an inferior good, it could go that way if it's a normal good. And you have to identify and say, this is what's going on here. Questions so far? Okay. Price expectations. Generally speaking, if you expect prices to rise, so if your expectation is an increase in prices in the future, that will increase demand today. And likewise, if you expect prices to decrease in the future, you'll decrease your demand today, it'll increase your demand in the future. So this particular phenomenon is what drives people that have to set prices around Christmas time crazy, because they're trying to decide, do I go ahead and have holiday pricing discounts before Christmas? That's going to lower my prices and I'll get much, but do I get more people in the door? Or are people should I just wait, but people will hesitate to buy stuff till after Christmas? So there's always this trade-off that they're dealing with. You may or may not have heard of it because there hasn't been a lot in the news about it. I think we don't understand the implications of it. But Europe, including oil prices, actually experienced something called deflation in the last quarter. In other words, general prices fell. In the recent, it sounds like to you and me, oh, general prices fell. That's great. But if you're an economist or you're Merkel or you're somebody trying to run a country and you see prices going down, you go, oh no, if consumers start to accept or expect that prices are going to fall, what's going to happen to demand for goods and services? They're going to go down. And there's a big worry in Europe right now that you're going to have this general price deflation because expectations are going to be that, oh, prices are going to go down in the future. I might as well, I'll forestall buying that car, or I won't get this, or I won't go on this trip, or whatever the case may be, because the price of it's going to be less in the future. So there's always that worry. And what you certainly do here, if you keep your ears listening to the radio, is you're going to hear stuff about the Federal Reserve Bank has inflation targets of 2%, and they're worried. And you would think, well, why don't they have an inflation target of 0? Why wouldn't inflation at 0 be great? Well, the reason they don't like a 0 inflation target is because of this price expectation issue. And if prices start to fall, then demand for goods and services starts to go down. So there's a worry there. But it happens in the marketplace generally too. So some people will wait if they expect the prices of cars to fall a lot because there's going to be a sale where they have, they'll forestall that purchase until prices start to fall after Christmas, or it's a year-end deal, or whatever the case may be. So expectations comes into market decisions all the time. What's the last one? So far what we have is we have the ability to go ahead and say, we have demand, and it's a function of the price of the good itself. This is movement along a curve. And price of substitutes, price of complements, income, and price expectations. And these are all cost shifts in one direction or another. That's cute. Yeah. And what's notable about all 5 of those things is if you know what the change is, you can predict which way price is going to go or which way the demand curve is going to go. So you can go ahead and say, oh, if the price falls, I'm going to move along the demand curve, and there's going to be a larger quantity of demand. You can predict that. And likewise, you can say, well, if incomes rise and this is a normal good, the demand for this good is going to shift out. Same with prices of substitutes and complements and expectations. So with all of these, you have a level of predictability. You can tell direction of change. And later on, when we're in a market, we may actually be able to go to where the price actually ends up. But you can predict changes in the market with these. And the last thing I'm going to put up here is tastes. Tastes are ephemeral. We know that tastes change demand, but we can't necessarily predict how it's going to change or when it's going to occur, or always even what direction it's going to be. So all of a sudden, fashion's the biggest one. There's a spring show and there's demand for certain sorts of dresses. We know that the demand for that particular sort of dress is going to increase, but that could change rapidly. The only thing that's changing there is changes in tastes. People's tastes are being affected by some particular phenomenon. We don't know, just off the top of our head, how changes in taste are going to affect the marketplace, unless we get really specific and go ahead and say, okay, dresses with a certain hemline or a certain floral pattern are now the big thing on runways. So we know that demand for those are going to increase. And demand for this, and dresses with this hemline and this solid pattern are no longer in demand. Demand for that stuff's going to go down. But we have to get very specific with the taste changes. So what you're going to see is I hand you articles on oil or housing or all sorts of other stuff. But we're looking at changes in the marketplace. that on the demand side, we're either moving simply along the curve with a change in price, or there's something that's being talked about in the news that talks about a change in the price of a substitute or a complement or people's incomes or something like that that's causing a shift in the curve in one direction or another. And once we add a supply curve into this, it means that the market's going to change in some way or another. So this is sort of, it is the foundation of the demand analysis we do. When we're looking at demand or changes in demand or changes in quantity of demand or markets and how certain events change the demand side of the equation, we're looking at these 4 or 5 or 6 different components of the marketplace. Substitutes, complements, incomes, expectations, tastes, and the price of the good itself. So when you start doing these problems, and as we start doing more analysis later on, we're always dealing with one of these on the demand side. Any questions so far? Okay. So there is an analogous piece to this on the supply side. And while there isn't what we call a law of supply, we do invoke an analogous piece that says quantity supplied and price vary in a positive direction. In other words, if the price of oil goes up, people that own oil wells pump more oil. If the demand for dresses with a certain hemline and a certain pattern goes up so that the price of those goods goes up in the marketplace, people will supply more of them. So what that gives us is upward sloping supply curves. And the same thing that we observed on the demand side is that these things can have any shape we want them. They just have to be upward sloping. That's all we're concerned about. And their shape is going to be determined by technology and other parts of the marketplace and lots of other things, but they are upward sloping. And this supply relationship, price relationship we're talking about is, like the law of demand, movement along the supply curve. We're going to come back to it in a minute and show how the supply curve shifts. But when we're talking about the law of demand and the analogous, for lack of a better term, law of supply, we're again talking about movements along a single curve, not shifts in these curves. This one's bounded the same way. You can have an almost perfectly flat supply curve, and you can have an almost perfectly vertical supply curve. The shapes of these things become important, as we'll see in things like public policy. So if you have, for instance, as we'll get to this, we tax, on the demand side, we tax cigarettes and booze. And we should be taxing the hell out of pot. We're not doing that yet. Why do we do that? Because you can raise the price a lot and people don't change the amount they buy very much. So they have what we call very inelastic demand for those things. So you collect lots of revenue. What you're trying to do in those cases, although we say we're trying to restrict certain sorts of activity, generally speaking what we're doing is trying to raise revenue. Although interestingly enough, as we'll come back to, why is the price of cigarettes so high? At least what's the rationale for it? It's to keep kids from smoking, and it actually works. So it didn't, so when I was a kid, you could buy a pack of cigarettes for $1, so we all smoked. Okay, it's, or we stole it from our parents or whatever it was, and they didn't notice. But now, what's the pack? I don't even know what a pack of cigarettes is. $10. It's 13 and $14 in New Jersey. My brother's girlfriend, about once a month, on a Sunday, drives down to North Carolina and fills her car up with cigarettes. Prays that she doesn't get stopped, because she can get them down there for $1.25 a piece and bring them up, and she can smoke like a chimney and sell them. So that's very wrong. But we tax those things. We've set up taxing systems, and that's one of the interesting tax systems that's actually working. It's changed the demand for kids because they are so expensive. Of course, what kids do is they go to roll on their own. That's the first step. What do you think? Was it? I think it was in Washington that they were trying to tax. It was either cans of tobacco really heavily or papers themselves, one or the other. And somebody went nuts on it when they tried to impose that one. But people try to figure out ways around taxes all the time. But the point I'm making here is that the shape of the supply curve, whether it's really steep or really flat, and the shape of the demand curve, and the shape of whether it's really steep or really flat, will determine all sorts of phenomena that might happen in the marketplace. So for instance, the supply of housing in the short run. Just think of apartments in Seattle. In the really short run, the supply curve looks about like it's about like that. It's not perfectly steep because if prices get really high, it gets like the Olympics. People start renting out their rooms. Don't do anything. So, and the supply will actually expand as you start getting room rates at $1,000 a night or something. But generally speaking, the supply of housing in the short run is pretty steep. The supply of housing is pretty steep. The demand for housing is also pretty steep in the short run. So you end up with all sorts of interactions in the marketplace. Other goods like M&Ms, again, has really flat demand, changes the implications of how you tax, whether you want to tax sweets or not. When you tax booze, you tax all booze instead of just one kind of booze, because if you tax just one kind of booze, people just switch from bourbon to rye. If you tax bourbon, they just switch over. So these shapes will matter, as we see. We'll get into, and we're talking about elasticities as we do this. But what determines what these things look like? So we have supply curves, and there's a positive relationship that's moving along a curve. And then there's things that will shift. The first thing that we can do is technological change. Generally speaking, we think of technological change as something that lowers costs and causes, so if you have an improvement in technology, that will shift the supply curve out, so it'll go that way. More will be supplied at every price. There's actually an analogous piece that's associated with negative technological change. And that is, if the government comes in and bans the use of something, so you can no longer do this, or you can no longer do that, or you have to add a safety feature to something. So you could have technological change that works in the other direction. So suppose you can no longer use mercury in virtually any product in the United States. That's changed those production functions, made it more expensive for firms to produce goods and services because they have to substitute some more expensive thing. So you can actually have negative technological change that shifts things back. And a lot of people would argue that a lot of government regulation fits the same pattern. Government regulation will, in often cases, decrease the incentives to supply and cause supply curves to shift out. So regulation is another piece. any increase in regulation usually has a negative impact on supply. Doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it has a negative impact. And then there's the price of inputs. So inputs are anything that goes into the production function. So if you're producing chocolate chip cookies and the price of chocolate chips goes up, you're going to produce fewer cookies. So if the price of an input rises, the supply curve shifts in. And likewise, if the price of an input falls, the supply curve shifts out. So, we've talked sort of casually about oil prices and gasoline prices in terms of consumers, you and I being the consumer. But a huge amount of the energy that comes out of oil production and oil use in the United States is by producers of goods and services. And when the price of oil falls, the expectation is that there's, if you listen to the stock, you probably don't listen to the stock market yet, but last week the stock market was in free fall. Supposedly there were falling oil prices. And then people are looking at, one set of people are looking at it going, oh, this is because of the Exxons and the big oil companies and the people that produce oil. They're going to be hurt by it. But there's also this whole other side, which are the energy consumers. And anybody that's a supplier that uses lots of energy is better off. We're going to see cheaper prices because supply curves are going to shift out. They're going to be able to produce more goods and services because of cheap oil. That's the ultimate outcome of these things. Texas is not happy with it. The Middle Eastern states are not happy with it. But consumers in general are starting to see positive impacts of lower oil prices. And the last one here is the price of alternative outputs. So that'll affect your supply curve. Suppose this is the supply curve for that's the supply curve for cheese. So you're a processor in the Midwest and you buy lots of milk from cattle producers and you make cheese. And the price of powdered milk is, say, $2 per unit, whatever that is. So you can also produce powdered milk, and the price of powdered milk is $2 of what you can sell it for. So you have a particular supply curve for cheese, knowing that you can also produce this other stuff. But all of a sudden, the price of powdered milk goes to $5 a unit. What happens to your production of cheese? It goes down. Because you're going to take resources out of production here. You're going to have to get a higher price for that cheese than you're getting now because you can just switch your resources into making powdered milk and make more money. So if you have alternatives in production, you're constantly looking at what you can switch that production between and among. And likewise, if the price of powdered milk falls, you're producing both of them, and the price of powdered milk goes to 50 cents, that's your supply curve for cheese would shift out. Because now you can make more money doing the cheese bit, even though you're getting a lower price than you could before when you were doing powdered milk at a higher price. So on the supply side, we have an analogous specification for supply. which is supply is a function of the price of the good itself. That's a positive relationship. And then you have changing technology, regulation, price of inputs, and price of alternative outputs. These are shifts, and this is movement along the curve. Everybody okay with that? Okay, we're going to do about 5 more minutes now. Okay. So we have these two components of the market. Whoops, did I erase it? Okay. You have the demand side. It's made up of consumers of one sort or another. They could be firms, they could be you and me. We have demand curves, and we have suppliers of goods and services, which we typically think of as firms, but could be individuals, they could be huge corporations. And we throw them in the same pot, and we get a market. Here's the demand for a good and the supply of a good. And we're going to postulate, at least for now, that we're going to have something called market equilibrium. It's where that supply and quantity supplied and quantity demanded is equal. And that'll generate a price in the marketplace. So for 95% of the analysis we do going forward, this is your starting point when we're looking at the market. We'll decide, okay, we've got market equilibrium here. And you can see, suppose the price is P1. Look up. So at a price of P1, that's how much firms want to supply, right? And this is how much consumers demand. Everybody with me on those two? So, what's that? So in this case, QD minus QS is going to be a shortage. In other words, the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied, and you have a shortage. In a market system, what do you think is going to happen? Firms are going to go ahead and say, oh, people are calling me up seeing if they can reserve stuff. I'm selling out early in the morning, make bread or something, and it's gone by 10. I can start raising my prices. And demanders are saying, I want this stuff. I'm going to start demanding, I'm going to offer higher prices. And as that happens, you start moving up the supply curve, and you start moving up this demand curve. And as that occurs, what happens to the difference between quantity demanded and quantity supplied? It gets smaller and smaller until, at some point, you get close to market clearing. Now, it may be, keep in mind, look up again, that the price ends up here for some reason. They overstate the hand here. So now what do you have? You got this much is demanded and this much is supplied, and you have surplus. Then what happens? Firms' inventories start rising, they go, oh damn, we're producing too much, we need to lower the price. They start lowering the price, As they lower the price, the quantity demanded increases, the quantity supplied is decreasing. You're headed towards that equilibrium again. The market, as we see it, and as you have to understand it, is constantly moving. It's dynamic. There are no static prices. Things don't stop. There's always, marketplaces are always moving around some equilibrium price. There's some change being made. And we're always, you need to always imagine, at least in a market that's not fettered by particular odd pieces of regulation or some weird constraints on the actors in the marketplace, there's always going to be a tendency to head towards this equilibrium price and quantity. These are, in a sense, sacred pieces. Now, we may have things that change what that equilibrium price and quantity is, but at least as a foundation piece, markets are always tending towards equilibrium. The suppliers are always trying to get the highest profits out by charging the price that gives them the best profit they can get, and consumers are always trying to get the best deal given what their demand is, and you're always headed towards that equilibrium point. So when we talk about market dynamics and activity in marketplaces, we're talking about constantly trying to head towards that equilibrium. And again, it's a dynamic place. It's not a static piece. And then I'm going to leave you here, but what you're going to, so you can do this on your own, is what you see is if you're starting out with this equilibrium price and quantity, and you interject into the marketplace something that says, oh, the price of a substitute for this good just went up astronomically. So the demand for this good goes from D1 to D2. What's a D2? What happens in the marketplace? Well, all of a sudden demand's gone up to here. At the current price, you have a shortage. And if you have a shortage, demanders are going to start bidding up the price. As they start bidding up the price, what are suppliers going to do? They're going to supply more. You've had a shift in the demand curve and movement along the supply curve as you're headed towards a new equilibrium. That's what's happening in markets all the time. There's some shift going on, and that shift is causing it's either a demand shift or a supply shift, and that is causing that market equilibrium to change in quantity supplied and demanded change all the time. So you're going to see firms entering the business or producing more goods. You're going to see demanders moving to other goods and services, etc. And that constant flux is going on. So what I want you to do for Monday is go through those problems and do some of these problems that have shifts in them. Start with the equilibrium, understand that you're shifting things around, but you always tend to look at the equilibrium. Okay, I'll see you on Monday.